It is said that in an age of universal deceit, the act of speaking truth is a revolutionary act. But in the nightmare of the 41st millennium, truth has been strangled by the red tape of the administratum and the screams of the heretic. Mankind's folly was never its ambition, but its inconsistency. We have forged a galaxy of a million laws, yet we possess no justice. Into this decaying ossuary of bureaucracy falls an anomaly, a relic of an era where the law was not a suggestion whispered in the dark, but physical weight carried in a holster. He does not serve the High Lords. He does not bow to the ecclesiarchy. He is the iron in the blood of a dying species. A man who does not seek the light of the Emperor, for he carries his own torch, the flickering neon and cold promethium of a megacity that time forgot. Terra trembles. For the first time in 10,000 years, the guilty have a reason to fear. The sentence is death. The underbelly of Hive Primus was a place where the light of the God Emperor had long since been strangled by the toxic miasma of industrial runoff and the crushing weight of 5 miles of Gothic architecture overhead. In the Sump Level 9, a district abandoned by the light and the law alike, the air was a thick soup of recycled promethium fumes and the copper tang of old blood. Here, the local enforcers did not patrol. They merely survived, taking bribes from the corpse-starch syndicates and looking the other way as the gutter-skinned gangers carved out tiny, filthy kingdoms. It was in this cradle of stagnant corruption that the reality of the Militarum buckled. A localized warp thinner, triggered by a faulty geothermal stabilizer, tore a jagged, violet wound in the air. There was no demonic incursion, no chorus of the damned. Only a silent, implosive thunder that shattered the ferrocrete floor and spat a single, armored figure into the filth of the 41st millennium. Precinct Marshal Varus, a man whose soul was as scarred as a flak plate, was the first to arrive. He led a squad of 10 Arbites, their boots splashing to the radioactive sludge as their lum globes cut through the gloom. They expected to find a warp beast or a shredded corpse. Instead, they found a titan of meat and black leather sitting amidst the smoldering wreckage of a collapsed cooling tower. The stranger was draped in a uniform that defied imperial aesthetics, a bodysuit of midnight black, reinforced by a heavy green padding at the joints and a breastplate of burnished gold shaped into a fierce, aquiline eagle. His face was obscured by a helmet of crimson and black, the visor a T-shaped slit of impenetrable darkness. Beside him lay a strange, compact firearm and a massive, heavy-treaded bike that hummed with a low-frequency vibration that set Varus's teeth on edge. "Identify yourself, mutant," Varus spat, his combat shotgun leveled at the stranger's chest. The air around the newcomer shimmered with a lingering chronal displacement, the scent of ozone clashing with the hive's rot. The stranger didn't move for a long heartbeat, his gloved hands resting on his knees. Then, with mechanical smoothness that spoke of a lifetime of violence, he stood. He was shorter than a space marine, but possessed a density of presence that seemed to warp the very gravity of the room. He did not reach for his weapon. Instead, he looked at the corrupt marshal, his visor reflecting the flickering green light of the sump. "I am the law," the stranger rasped, his voice a low, gravel-grinding baritone that carried the weight of a death sentence. It wasn't a boast. It was a cold, objective statement of fact. The tension in the chamber snapped when a gutter-skinned ganger, hidden in the overhead rusted pipes, attempted to seize a moment. The criminal lunged with a jagged monomolecular blade, aiming for the stranger's exposed neck. The stranger didn't even turn his head. His hand moved in a blur, his fingers wrapping around the grip of the Lawgiver. "Executioner," he commanded. The weapon chirped in a synthesized tone, confirming the vocal lock. A single shot rang out, not the messy spray of stubber or the crack of a lost bolt, but a precision-guided detonation that sought out the ganger's heat signature and erased his head from existence in a spray of gray matter. Varus and his men recoiled. The technology was alien, yet the intent was purer than anything they had seen in the Emperor's service. Varus stepped forward, his greed overcoming his caution. "That weapon is unsanctioned tech. By the authority of the Lord Helmar and the Lex Imperialis, I confiscate that." He never finished the sentence. The stranger stepped into the marshal's personal space, the gold eagle on his shoulder pad gleaming like a predatory bird. "Your city is a cancer," the judge growled, his voice vibrating through Varus's chestplate. "Your statutes are compromised with chaos. I've read your Lex. It is a plea for mercy. I do not grant mercy. With a single brutal strike of his gloved fist, Dredd shattered the marshal's jaw, sending the corrupt official sprawling into the muck. The other Arbites lowered their weapons, not out of fear, but out of a sudden, terrifying realization. They were looking at the man they were always supposed to be. The Judge had arrived on Terra. The annexation of Sector 7G was not a conquest of arms, but a systematic eradication of inefficiency. Within 48 hours of his arrival, the man known as Dredd had transformed the precinct fortress from a den of vice into a cold, functioning machine of retribution. He moved through the labyrinthine halls of the Administratum with a terrifying, rhythmic pace, his heavy boots echoing against the vaulted ceilings like the tolling of a funeral bell. To the Lex mechanics and scribes, he was a ghost from a more disciplined age. To the criminals of the Spire, he was an inevitability. He did not care for the political nuances of the High Lords or the spiritual mandates of the Mini-Storum. To Dredd, there were only two states of being, compliance or violation. He spent his nights poring over the Lex Imperialis, his cybernetic-enhanced mind flagging the mercy clauses and bureaucratic delays as structural weaknesses to be purged. The first true test of his authority came during the audit of the Timekeepers. A mid-level adept, bloated on embezzled rations and protected by a private guard hive scum, attempted to bar Dredd's entry into the Great Archive. The judge did not present a warrant. He simply vocalized a code to his lawgiver. The resulting armor-piercing round didn't just kill the guard. It punched through the reinforced plasteel door, leaving a molten hole that smelled of ozone and ionized copper. Dredd stepped over the smoldering remains, his visor fixed on the trembling adept. "Corruption is a breach of the public trust," Dredd intoned, his voice devoid of anger, possessing only the terrifying flatness of a falling guillotine. "The sentence is 20 years in the ice cubes. Since you have no ice cubes, I will improvise." He then proceeded to seal the official inside his own airtight vault, leaving him with nothing but his ledgers and a single oxygen canister. As word of the Iron Judge spread, a strange phenomenon began to take root in the lower hab blocks. The downtrodden masses, who had lived for generations under the boot of indifferent overlords, saw in Dredd something the Imperial Creed had failed to provide: consistency. They began to forge crude badges out of scrap metal, pinning them to their rags in a pathetic imitation of the Judge's golden eagle. This cult of the badge was not based on worship, but on a desperate hunger for a law that applied to the rich as harshly as the poor. Dredd viewed this development with typical pragmatism. He did not want their prayers, nor did he recognize the Emperor as a god. To him, the Emperor was a Chief Justice who had been incapacitated, leaving the law in the hands of the incompetent. The tension reached a boiling point when a deacon of the ecclesiarchy, flanked by two fanatical sisters of battle, confronted Dredd in the middle of a public execution of a black market organ smuggler. The deacon screamed blasphemy, pointing a trembling finger at Dredd's refusal to kneel before the Aquila. The sisters, their bolters locked and loaded, waited for the word to strike. Dredd didn't flinch. He adjusted his glove and stared down the barrels of the god-worthy weapons. "The law does not require a temple," he stated, his voice carrying over the crowd like a thunderclap. "It requires a spine. You preach to the guilty to save their souls. I execute the guilty to save the city." There is no overlap in our jurisdictions. For the first time in his life, the deacon found himself silenced by a conviction that rivaled his own. By the end of the week, the sector had reached zero-incident status, not through peace, but through sheer unadulterated fear. The sound of the lawmaster's high-pitched turbine became the new anthem of the district. Dredd sat atop his machine, watching the screens of a repurposed servo-skull as it fed him data on every hab unit in the sector. He saw the rot of the 41st millennium for what it was, not a spiritual failing, but a failure of enforcement. He began to draft the Terran Amendments, a series of legal reforms that would strip the nobility of their immunity and turn the entire hive into a giant, functioning ice cube. The shadow of the Judge was growing, and for the first time in millennia, the gears of the administrator began to turn with a terrifying, bloody precision. The sudden stagnation of crime in Sector 7G did not go unnoticed by those who dwell in the shadows of the Golden Throne. Inquisitor Vane of the Ordo Hereticus, a man who had spent 3 centuries scouring the galaxy for the scent of the Psyker and the Mutant, viewed Dredd's miraculous efficiency with deep-seated suspicion. To the Inquisition, Absolute order without the guidance of the ecclesiarchy was often the precursor to a more insidious heresy, the worship of the self. Vane sat in the darkness of his strategium, watching grainy pick captures of the Iron Judge executing a hive noble without a trial. There was no warp taint detected by the nearby Null Maidens, yet Dredd moved with a preternatural certainty that bordered on the supernatural. Vane declared the stranger an anomaly alpha and sanctioned a capture and censure mission, deploying a strike team of Kazakan stormtroopers to bring the vigilante to the Iron Star torture cells for questioning. The ambush was sprung in the dead zone, a labyrinth of collapsed hab spires and leaking coolant pipes. The Kazakan, masters of urban suppression, moved with silent coordination, their hot-shot lost guns humming in the damp air. They utilized a choke pattern maneuver, surrounding Dredd as he patrolled the perimeter of a black market stim lab. Suddenly, the darkness was shattered by the blinding flare of photon grenades. "Surrender in the name of the Holy Ordo," the sergeant bellowed over the Vox. Dredd didn't squint. His visor's anti-glare filters snapped into place instantly. He dove behind a rusted chassis of a burnt-out Lehman Rust tank, the Lawgiver already barking in his hand. "Standard execution," he commanded. The weapon responded with a series of high-velocity thuds, punching through the stormtroopers' reinforced carapace armor with terrifying ease. As the firefight intensified, Dredd realized he wasn't fighting mere gangers. These were professionals. He tapped his belt, selecting smoke and gas rounds. The narrow alleyway was instantly engulfed in a thick, choking veil of chemical fog. Using his helmet's thermal imaging, Dredd moved like a predator through the mist. He did not aim for center mass. He aimed for the joints, the islets, and the weapon muzzles. He used the terrain of the hive like a master tactician, leaping between rusted gantries and sliding under steaming pipes. To the Kazakan, it felt as though they were fighting a shadow that fired back with the force of a thunderbolt. Dredd wasn't just surviving. He was policing the battlefield, treating every incoming lost bolt as a fresh violation of the peace. Inquisitor Vane, watching through a servo-skull's eye, grew frustrated. He stepped from his concealment, his power stake crackling with blue energy. "Stop this madness." Vane roared, his voice amplified by a voxcaster. "You are an unsanctioned entity operating on the throne world. You are a walking blasphemy." Dredd emerged from the smoke, his Lawgiver held in a low-ready position. He didn't look at the Inquisitor's badge of office. He looked at the man's eyes. "I've encountered your kind before," Dredd rasped, his voice echoing in the tight corridor. "Self-appointed gods who think they're above the code. In my city, we call you corrupt officials. You've authorized the use of lethal force against an officer of the law. The penalty is death." The standoff was interrupted by a psychic scream that tore through the air. A Kazakan psyker, overwhelmed by the stress of the hunt, had suffered the perils of the warp event. The reality around the squad began to bleed as a minor warp rift threatened to tear open. The stormtroopers fell back in terror, but Dredd stepped forward. He didn't pray, and he didn't call upon the Emperor. He simply switched his Lawgiver to incendiary. A stream of white-hot phosphorus erupted from the barrel, cauterizing the rift and the possessed psyker in a single, brutal act of purification. Vane stood frozen, his power stake useless. Dredd approached the Inquisitor, the barrel of his smoking gun pressing against Vane's forehead. "You're under arrest, Vane. You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it." Below the hive spires lies the Sump, a realm where biology has surrendered to the toxic whims of 1,000 years of chemical waste. To the citizens above, the Under-hive is a myth of monsters. To Judge Dredd, it was merely another precinct in need of a sweep. He descended into the lightless depths following the trail of a high-level heretic, a rogue bio-adept who had fled the audit of the Iron Star. The air here was a gelatinous fog of sulfur and rot, so thick it muffled the roar of his lawmaster's engine. Mutants, their limbs twisted into obscene parodies of the human form by generations of radiation, watched in the shadows of rusted cooling fans. Dredd did not feel pity for these abhumans, as the Imperium termed them. In his original jurisdiction, a mutant was a violation of the genetic code. Here, they were evidence of a planet-wide failure of sanitation and law. The silence of the sump was broken by a rhythmic, wet clicking, a sound Dredd recognized as the movement of a coordinated swarm. He was not being hunted by mere scavengers. Emerging from the slime-coated vents were creatures of terrifying efficiency, genestealers. These were not the lumbering mutants of the megacity's cursed Earth, but apex predators from the stars, their purple carapaces glistening with foul ichor. Dredd skidded his lawmaster into a defensive broadside, the heavy bike's twin cannons barking as they tore through the lead Xenos. Biohazard, he commanded his lawgiver, switching to a high-density toxin round designed to liquefy organic tissue. The combat was a blur of silver steel and purple blood, the judge moving with a cold, mechanical economy of motion that allowed no room for the luxury of fear. As the genestealer cultists, begrimed workers with third arms and bulging foreheads, joined the fray, Dredd found himself in the middle of a sectarian war. The cultists viewed him as a metallic demon sent by the false emperor, while Dredd viewed them as a massive, multi-count violation of the health and safety statutes regarding extraterrestrial parasites. He utilized his bike's scatter mines, turning the narrow tunnel into a kill zone of shrapnel and flame. "You have the right to be purged," he growled over his Vox speaker, his voice drowning out the cultists' hissing prayers. He moved through the swarm not as a warrior seeking glory, but as an exterminator clearing an infestation. Every shot was a calculated expenditure. Every movement was a lesson in lethality. The chase culminated in a vast, vaulted cathedral of rusted iron, a hidden shrine to the four-armed emperor. At the center stood the rogue bio-adept, now a twisted thrall to the broodmind. He stood atop a pile of stolen Imperial munitions, laughing as he prepared to detonate a cyclonic charge that would collapse the entire sector. Dredd didn't waste breath on a monologue. He targeted the charging mechanism with a heat-seeker round. The bullet danced through the air, weaving between the pillars of the shrine, before punching through the Adept's primary manipulator arm. The explosion was localized but devastating, sending the heretic spiraling into the dark sludge below. Dredd walked to the edge of the pit. His lawgiver held at his side. The genestealer patriarch, a massive, multi-limbed nightmare of muscle and chitin, emerged from the shadows of the shrine to avenge its brood. It towered over Dredd, its psychic presence a physical weight that would have shattered a lesser man's mind. But Dredd's mind was a fortress of singular purpose. There was no room for psychic intrusion when the law occupied every thought. He looked the beast in its four alien eyes and reached for his high-explosive rounds. Trespassing, resisting arrest, unauthorized possession of a hive world. Dredd listed the charges, his voice steady even as the floor cracked under the patriarch's weight. As the beast lunged, Dredd fired point-blank into its open maw. The resulting detonation painted the rusted cathedral in alien violet, leaving the judge standing alone in the silence of the sump. The ripples of Dredd's great audit finally reached the inner palace, prompting the deployment of the Emperor's ultimate sanction. To the Adeptus Astartes of the Imperial Fists, Terra was not merely a world. It was a sacred trust of stone and blood. Sergeant Hadrian, a veteran of 3 centuries of siege warfare, led his squad into the lower spires to intercept the vigilante of the badge. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy thrum of power armor reactors. When the two forces met in the processional of heroes, the contrast was jarring. The Imperial Fist stood like golden statues of antiquity, ornate and massive, while Dredd remained a dark, lean specter of uncompromising pragmatism. Hadrian demanded Dredd's immediate surrender for interference with the divine order of the throne world, his bolt gun leveled with the practiced ease of a demigod. Dredd merely adjusted his stance, his gloved hand resting on the hilt of his lawgiver. "Divine order is no excuse for a lapse in procedure, Sergeant." Dredd's voice rasped through the Vox grill, devoid of the awe usually afforded to the Space Marines. The negotiation lasted mere seconds before the logic of the bolter took over. Hadrian fired a warning shot, the mass reactive shell vaporizing a statue of a saint behind Dredd. The judge didn't flinch. Instead, he initiated protocol, evasion. He utilized the verticality of the Gothic architecture, firing a grapple line from his belt and swinging into the shadows of the vaulted ceiling. From the darkness, he deployed high-X rounds, not aiming for the Astartes ceramite chest plates, but for the floor beneath their feet. The shock waves were calculated to disrupt their stabilization gyros, proving that even a god of war must obey the laws of physics. The skirmish became a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. Dredd knew he could not win a test of brute strength against the Sons of Dorn, so he fought like a man who had spent decades policing a city of 800 million criminals. He used chaff, grenades to blind the Astartes' auto-senses, and rubber ricochet rounds to bank shots off the ferrocrete pillars, striking the soft power cables behind their knee joints. Sergeant Hadrian, growing frustrated with this mortal's tenacity, activated his combat blade and charged. The air screamed as the monomolecular edge cut the wind. Dredd met the charge not with a weapon, but with a flashbang detonation at point-blank range, followed by a brutal strike from his daystick against the sergeant's helmet lens. It was a move born of 1,000 street brawls, stripped of knightly honor and replaced with cold efficiency. As the smoke cleared, the two warriors stood in a tense stalemate. Hadrian's helmet was cracked, and Dredd's leather suit was scorched by bolt wash. The Astartes sergeant paused, his tactical cogitators struggling to categorize a man before him. Dredd wasn't a heretic, nor was he a Xeno-sympathizer. He possessed a singular, terrifying purity of purpose that mirrored the Astartes' own. "You fight with the discipline of a legionary," Hadrian observed, his voice a low rumble of grudging respect. "But you lack a master, who gave you the right to judge the Emperor's realm." Dredd didn't lower his gun. "The law gave me the right. It was here before you, and if you fail, it will be here after you. A badge isn't a gift, Sergeant. It's a burden." The arrival of the Lawmaster bike, remote piloted by Dredd's vocal commands, broke the deadlock. The machine roared into the hall, its twin cannons providing a suppressive screen that allowed Dredd to mount up in a single, fluid motion. He didn't flee. He repositioned. The Imperial Fist did not pursue with lethal intent, their vox channels humming with new directive from the phalanx. Observe and report. As Dredd accelerated away, his tires leaving black streaks on the sacred marble, Hadrian looked down at the floor. Scratched into the stone was a single word: guilty. The sergeant realized then that Dredd wasn't just a vigilante. He was a mirror reflecting the messy, lawless reality of an empire that had forgotten its own rules. The trial by Bolter had ended, but the judgment of Terra had only just begun. The Senatorum Imperialis is a place where the air is heavy with the weight of 1,000,000 worlds and the suffocating perfume of ancient incense. Beneath the gargantuan, vaulted ceilings of the inner palace, the High Lords of Terra gathered to address the lawman anomaly. Dredd was brought before the council not as a prisoner, but as a curiosity, a force of nature that had achieved in weeks what the provost marshal had failed to do in centuries. He stood in the center of the mosaic floor, his heavy boots unmoved by the presence of the most powerful humans in the galaxy. He did not remove his helmet. He did not bow. To Dredd, these were not the masters of mankind. They were administrators who had allowed the Big Meg of the galaxy to fall into a state of terminal disrepair. The Grand Provost Marshal, a man draped in layers of heavy velvet and gold, stood to deliver the ultimatum. "You have executed thousands without the sanction of the Lex Imperialis," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the statues of Primarchs. "You have assaulted the Emperor's chosen and destabilized the tide flow of the throne world. By every law of the Imperium, you are a dead man." Dredd's response was a low, steady vibration of cold iron. "The law is not a tool for your convenience, Marshal. I've reviewed your records. You've accepted bribes from a novice nobleite to overlook black market warp routes. You allowed hive nobles to hunt civilians for sport. You aren't the law. You're a common criminal with a fancy title." The silence that followed was so absolute it felt like a physical vacuum. The tension was shattered when the master of the Assassinorum signaled the activation of a hidden security measure. From the shadows of the rafters, a shape blurred into motion. An Everzer assassin, a hyperdrugged engine of slaughter, was unleashed. The creature was a whirlwind of claws and needles, screaming a distorted vox-amplified screech of unleashed fear. Dredd's reflexes, honed by decades of dealing with slow-mo addicts and augmented psychos, snapped into a lethal rhythm. He didn't fire his Lawgiver immediately. Instead, he utilized his daystick, the heavy, weighted truncheon striking with the force of a hydraulic press. He parried the assassin's poison claw, the sound of wood on ceramite ringing like a bell, before commanding his sidearm, armor piercing. The duel was a blur of black leather and red gore. Dredd moved with a calculated economy, absorbing a shallow cut to his shoulder to bait the Everzer into a commit. As the assassin lunged, Dredd fired 3 rounds into its chest. The Everzer's bio-meltdown protocol began to trigger, a chemical explosion that would have leveled the council chamber. Sensing the danger, Dredd grabbed the dying assassin by its harness and hurled it into the gravity well of the palace's waste chute, the detonation muffled by miles of lead-line conduits. He turned back to the High Lords, his helmet spattered with acidic blood. Assaulting a judge, Dredd rasped, is a capital offense. Who's next? Faced with a warrior who had just dismantled one of their most feared assets, the High Lords pivoted from execution to exploitation. They realized that Dredd could not be broken, but he could be aimed. In a move of desperate political theater, they declared him the Lord High Arbiter of Terra, a title that technically placed him outside the traditional hierarchy, answering only to the law itself. They hoped he would burn himself out in the lower hives. Dredd accepted the badge, a massive iron-cast star, not as an honor, but as a warrant. He turned and walked out of the chamber, his mind already calculating the logistics of his first major action, an audit of the High Lords' own private estates. The gambit had succeeded, but the High Lords had just invited the executioner into their own homes. With the iron star of the Lord High Arbiter pinned to his chest, Dredd did not target the dens of the lowly. He aimed the law at the heart of the imperial machine. The Administratum, a planetary-scale bureaucracy of a quintillion scribes, had become a stagnant swamp of red-tape heresy. Dredd initiated the Great Audit, a systematic sweep of the Sector Primus archives. He led a phalanx of grim-faced Arbites, their suppression shields interlocking like a wall of iron. They did not come for tithes. They came for the ledgers. Dredd walked through the endless aisles of parchment, his Lawgiver's heat-seeker rounds replaced with incendiary shells, ready to burn any record that hid a crime. To Dredd, a misfiled grain shipment was not a mistake. It was a theft from the citizens of the Imperium, and the penalty for such negligence was written in blood. The purge reached the gilded choirs, the high-level counting houses where the nobility's wealth was laundered into the imperial tithes. Thousands of corrupt clerks, some who had inherited their seats of power through centuries of nepotism, were marched from their velvet-lined offices into the cold, rain-slicked execution squares. The air was filled with the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of the Arbites' boots and the mechanical drones of servo-skulls broadcasting the sentences of the day. Dredd stood atop a repurposed Rhino APC, his voice amplified to a tectonic rumble. "You have built a mountain of paper to hide a valley of sin," he declared to the kneeling masses of the elite. "The law has no time for your lineage. It only has time for the truth." Resistance materialized not in the form of soldiers, but in a desperate rebellion of the gilded choirs. The nobility hired mercenary void hounds, veteran soldiers with illegal bionic enhancements, to protect their estates. A fierce urban battle erupted among the statues of the Hall of Records. The mercenaries used gravity wells and prohibited phosphex weapons to halt the judge's advance. Dredd responded with the Widowmaker round, a custom-calibrated shell that split into 3 microshrapnel bursts upon impact. He moved through the crossfire with the stoicism of a statue, his leather suit absorbing the heat of near misses. He wasn't just clearing a room. He was clearing a ledger 1 heartbeat at a time. The height of the purge saw Dredd enter the sanctum of the archivist, where a high clerk had barricaded himself behind ancient, forbidden security protocols. The clerk attempted to bribe Dredd with the wisdom of the ages, offering him a map to a hidden cache of Dark Age technology. Dredd didn't even look at the data slate. He simply stepped forward and crushed the device under his boot. "I don't care for your toys," Dredd growled, his visor inches from the clerk's weeping eyes. "I care for the 5 million citizens who starve in the lower sectors because you lost the food requisitions for 3 decades. He then vocalized ricochet to his weapon, firing a shot that bounced off the lead line walls to strike the clerk's private guard in their blind spots. By the time the sun set over the spires of the Administratum, the Great Audit had claimed 10,000 souls and saved 1 billion more from the slow death of bureaucratic neglect. The Terran amendments were being etched into the walls of the precinct fortresses by automated servitors. The nobility watched from their high balconies, paralyzed by the realization that their gold could not buy reprieve from a man in the red and black helmet. Dredd sat in the center of the now-silent archive, the only sound being the cooling of his lawmaster's engine. He knew this was only a localized cure. The rot was deep, and the shadow of the warp was lengthening. But for one day, on one world, the law was absolute. The Great Audit had inadvertently created a vacuum. By purging the corrupt but stable layers of the Administratum, Dredd had momentarily thinned the psychic veil of the throne world. Seizing the opportunity, a sliver cult of the Black Legion, hidden for decades in the Hive's tectonic foundations, rose like a fever. Led by a sorcerer lord named Malice the Vain, the heretics surged upward, their objective being the primary cooling conduits of the Golden Throne itself. As the palace sirens wailed a mournful, binary dirge, Dredd found himself at the vanguard of a different kind of war. This was not a breach of statute, but a breach of reality. The judge skidded his lawmaster through the avenue of saints, the bike sensor screaming as the ambient temperature plummeted, and the walls began to weep a foul, oily ichor. Malice the Vain was a nightmare of obsidian plate and writhing tentacles, a veteran of the Long War who viewed the concept of law as a pathetic mortal delusion. As the two forces collided near the Eternity Gate, Outer Works, the air became a hurricane of warp fire and high explosive shells. Dredd's Arbites were being slaughtered, their suppression shields melting under the sorcerer's psychic shrieks. Dredd, however, was an island of cold, terrifying sanity in a sea of madness. He did not possess the faith that the ecclesiarchy touted as the only shield against the warp. He possessed something far more resilient, a singular, unshakable belief in the objective reality of the code. To Dredd, a demon was not a spiritual threat. It was a vagrant entity operating without a visa in the Militarum. You cannot judge the abyss, little mortal. Malice roared, his voice a chorus of 1,000 screaming souls. He unleashed a bolt of pure entropy, designed to age its target into dust. Dredd didn't dodge. He utilized a reflector shell, a rare, ancient tech relic he had confiscated from a High Lord's private armory. The shell detonated midair, creating a localized kinetic dampening field that shattered the psychic bolt into harmless sparks. Dredd closed the distance, his lawmaster's front-mounted cannons chewing through the sorcerer's retinue of possessed. He was a blur of black leather and gold, his movement stripped of hesitation. He knew that in this fight, a single second of doubt was a death sentence. The battle reached its zenith in the hall of the Astronomican Shadow. Malice lunged, his black iron staff clashing against Dredd's daystick. The impact sent a shockwave that cracked the surrounding pillars. Dredd felt the sorcerer's mind clawing at his own, trying to find a crack of guilt or a shadow of fear to exploit. But the judge's mind was an ISA cube, sterile, windowless, and absolute. Your existence is a violation of the natural order. Section 1. Dredd growled, the proximity of the warp turning his voice into a metallic snarl. He jammed the barrel of his Lawgiver under the sorcerer's gorget. Command! High X command, double tap. The resulting explosion was not just physical, but symbolic. The sorcerer's physical form was shredded by the twin detonations, and his psychic essence, denied a foothold in Dredd's unyielding mind, was sucked back into the Empyrean. As the remaining cultists broke and fled, Dredd stood amidst the smoking remains of the Black Legionaries. He was bleeding from a dozen wounds, his eagle pauldron cracked, yet he remained upright. From the golden mist of the inner palace, a group of custodian guard emerged, their guardian spears lowered but not leveled. They had watched the entire engagement. They saw a man who had stared into the eye of terror and seen only a crime scene. For the first time, the Golden Throne protectors recognized an ally who required no light to see his path. The return of the pre-march Roboute Guilliman to Terra was a moment of celestial gravity, but for Judge Dredd, it was merely the arrival of a high-ranking witness. As the armor of fate hissed, its life support systems humming with the precision of a lost age, the avenging sun walked the halls of the inner palace to find them changed. The usual clutter of supplicants and the stench of decay had been replaced by a terrifying, sterile silence. Dredd stood at the foot of the tribune's dais, his lawmaster idling with a low, predatory growl that echoed off the ancient stones. Guilliman, a giant in cobalt and gold, looked down at the mortal who had seized the heart of his father's empire. He saw a man who didn't radiate the frantic zeal of the modern Imperium, but rather the cold, analytical rigidity of the old world, a logic that even the pre-march found uncomfortably familiar. They tell me you have brought the law to Terra. Guilliman spoke, his voice a resonant bass that seemed to vibrate the very air. But I see only a graveyard of bureaucracy. You have dismantled the systems that keep this world breathing. Dredd stepped forward, the iron star on his chest catching the pale light of the Astronomicon. Your systems were a corpse shroud, pre-march. You call it breathing. I call it a slow-motion riot. I didn't come here to build a garden. I came to clear a crime scene. Your Codex Astartes, Dredd paused, his visor tilting upward to meet the Primarch's gaze, is a fine set of suggestions, but it lacks a sentencing guideline for the negligence of the divine. The custodians shifted their grip on their spears, but Guilliman raised a hand, a flicker of grim amusement crossing his noble features. The parley was cut short by a final, desperate act of sabotage. A hidden cell of logic eaters, heretical tech priests who had escaped the audit, activated a scrap code bomb within the palace's atmospheric scrubbers. If detonated, it would flood the inner sanctum with neurotoxins, killing millions of essential servants and plunging the palace into a permanent dark age. Guilliman's tactical displays lit up with 1,000 red warnings, but the distance was too great even for a pre-march. Dredd, however, was already in motion. Guilliman, the judge barked, "Hold the perimeter. I'm the only one who knows the ventilation crawl spaces of the sector. I patrolled them every night for a month." Without waiting for permission, Dredd slammed his lawmaster into gear, the bike leaping across the marble floor in a spray of sparks. The chase through the palace's service arteries was a descent into a mechanical hell. Dredd navigated the spinning fan blades and high-pressure steam pipes with the instinct of a man born in a megacity. He found the tech priests huddled around a pulsating, biomechanical mass of wires and screaming flesh. They were chanting in the binary of the dark gods. Dredd didn't engage in a debate of faith. He utilized High-X, rounds to collapse the overhead support pillars, pinning the heretics beneath tons of ferrocrete. He reached the device with seconds to spare. His gauntlet hands moved with surgical precision, not the prayerful gestures of Martian tech adept, but the swift, practical movements of bomb squad veteran. He bypassed the scrap code not by hacking it, but by physically severing the logic cores with his combat knife. When Dredd returned to Great Hall, he was caked in grime and cooling fluid, his leather suit shredded. Guilliman stood waiting, the hand of Dominion resting at his side. The pre-march looked at the small, battered man and realized that Dredd was a mirror of the Great Crusade's original vision, stripped of its hope, but maintaining its iron discipline. "You are an anachronism," Guilliman said softly. "A man who believed the universe can be solved with a gavel and a gun. On any other world, I would have you executed for your arrogance." Dredd holstered his Lawgiver, the click echoing in the silence. "And on any other world, I'd arrest you for obstruction pre-march. But the law is bigger than both of us. The threat is neutralized. Now, let's talk about the corruption in the Ultramar tides. The Great Audit did not end with parade or a medal, for the law seeks no validation from those it governs. As the dust settled over the sanctified spires of Terra, the Lord High Arbiter's influence had become a permanent scar on the face of the throne world. The Administratum had been pruned into a lean, terrified shadow of its former self, and for the first time in 10 millennia, the common citizen felt the cold, indifferent protection of a code that did not care for their tithes. Dredd stood upon the highest rampart of the precinct fortress, looking out over the sprawling hive spires. He knew his presence was a paradox, a spark of absolute secular order in a galaxy fueled by religious madness. He had held the line, but he was a man out of time, a ghost from an era where right and wrong were not mere theological debates, but binary constants. The High Lords of Terra, though cowed, remained a nest of vipers. They offered Dredd a permanent seat on the council, a chance to become one of the masters of the galaxy. Dredd's response was a singular, gravelly grunt of dismissal. He did not want a throne. He wanted a beat. He realized that to stay in the halls of power was to eventually become the very thing he had purged, a bureaucrat. He spent his final hours on the throne world recording his Codex Justitia into the central voxcasters of the Arbites, a series of uncompromising protocols that would serve as a template for a new generation of lawmen. He left them not with a prayer to the Emperor, but with a warning. The law is not a shield for the weak. It is a weight for the strong. Carry it or be crushed by it. On the dawn of the final day, Dredd returned to the site of his arrival in the Sump. The warp thinning had stabilized, but the area remained a scorched wasteland. He was not alone. A lone custodian, clad in auramite that shimmered like a dying star, stood waiting by the breach. There were no words exchanged. The custodian simply handed Dredd a small, iron-bound canister, a gift from Guilliman. Inside was a pure, unadulterated data core of the Emperor's original legal drafts from the dawn of the Great Crusade. It was a recognition of kinship. Dredd secured the canister to his lawmaster, the bike's engine humming a low, mournful tune. He looked back at the Golden Palace one last time, his visor reflecting the distant, flickering light of the Astronomicon. With a sharp kick of the gear pedal, the judge turned his back on the seat of imperial power. He did not seek a return to Megacity 1. He knew the portal was a one-way bridge of ash. Instead, he rode into the waste of the forbidden zones, the radioactive deserts that lay between the great hives. He chose the life of the long walk, the traditional retirement of a senior judge who chooses to bring the law to the lawless frontiers. As the silhouette of his lawmaster vanished into the chemical haze of the Terran horizon, he left behind a planet that was fundamentally changed. The Arbites now wore the black leather of the judge beneath their carapace, and the word justice had replaced sacrifice in the lexicons of a million scribes. The legend of the Iron Judge would persist for centuries, a myth whispered by gangers and nobles alike. Some said he was a saint sent by the Emperor to punish the wicked. Others claimed he was a demon of order from the dark age of technology. But the truth was simpler. He was a man who refused to blink in a galaxy of shadows. As the camera pulls back from the desolate, wind-swept waste of Terra, we see a single, glowing red taillight disappearing into the eternal smog. There is no music, only the fading roar of a high-performance turbine and the rhythmic tolling of a distant bell. The sentence of the 41st millennium had been passed, and though the judge was gone, the law remained. It always remains.